Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Billi.
I'm Emma.
You might not know this, but we are now months away from a federal election in Australia. And yesterday, a new poll showed the coalition is ahead of the Labor Party on a two-party preferred basis for the first time since the last election. Now, we will explain exactly what that means in today's deep dive, but essentially, at a really basic level, it is good news for Opposition Leader Peter Dutton and bad news for Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
Okay, Billi, so today we're talking about a new poll that shows the coalition is ahead of Labor for the first time since the federal election in 2022. So pretty significant. It's been a long time since the coalition were in front of Labor, according to these polls. But before we get into what that means, why that's significant, a bit of political analysis on the current landscape, let's take it right back. Can you give us a quick rundown of the Australian political landscape?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start, kind of all of the things that you wish you were taught in school but never were.
That's the Daily Aus.
So we're going to give you a really quick, Politics Australia 101. So let's jump into it. Australia has two major parties. Labor, they are the left of centre major party in Australia. They are currently led by Anthony Albanese, who is the Prime Minister, and they won the last election, which, like you said, was in 2022. And then we have the Liberal Party. So they are the right of centre major party in Australia, and they're often referred to as the coalition, and we'll be referring to them as the coalition in this podcast because to form government in Australia, they join forces with the National Party. Now, the National Party are generally considered further to the right than the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party is led by Peter Dutton, who is currently the opposition leader.
Yes, and also worth noting when we're talking about the coalition, that is, yes, the Liberal Party, the National Party. Sometimes in the Australian political landscape, the Liberal Party and the National Party will differ on their approach to policies, on their ideas. The National Party tend to represent Australians in more regional, remote, rural locations. They typically represent parts of Australia that might have really dense farming communities. So they're typically associated more with agriculture, and the Liberal Party is prominent in cities as well as regional remote areas.
Yeah, and I'd say one of their most recognisable faces is Barnaby Joyce. So you probably recognise that name. He is from the National Party. Now, obviously, there are many more parties, but those are the two major parties that can form government in Australia. Now, another thing to mention in this little Politics 101 of Australia is that there is an election in Australia coming up. So we have an election cycle every 3 years. In the US, we know there is obviously an election coming up there. That is every 4 years. So in Australia, it's shorter. It's every 3 years. In my mind, it feels like we did just have an election.
Yeah, they come around quickly.
They come around so quickly. Now, we don't know when exactly Australia's next election will be, but we know that it will be before the 17th of May next year. I think we can pretty much completely safely rule out that it will happen this year. So it will be
never say never, Billi. Never say never.
You never know what Anthony Albanese is thinking, and he's the one who can basically decide when it happens before May next year. But we can safely say sometime in the next 7 months. I didn't fact check that maths, so hopefully that's right. Now, at the last election, Labor, again led by Anthony Albanese, beat the coalition, who was then led by Scott Morrison, by a pretty convincing margin. So Labor won 77 seats compared to the coalition's 58 seats.
And that was after nearly a decade of coalition government. So I think we often see cycles in Australian politics of whether or not the popular vote swings slightly to the left or slightly to the right. Sometimes, when any government has been in power for a long time, there's a bit of a course correction in terms of trends that we see throughout history.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that after that election, Labor was pretty popular, at least compared to their opposition, like you said, the coalition who had been in government at the federal level for about a decade. Labor was pretty popular across the nation after that last election, not only at the federal level, but also at the state and territory level in mainland Australia. Labor was in government in each of those governments at the jurisdiction level. So not only, again, was Labor in control at a national level, it was also in control at a state level, with Tasmania being the only exception there. That has since changed. The Northern Territory now has a Liberal government, and it looks like Queensland's government could be about to switch from Labor to coalition. Obviously, we don't know. They have an election in about 2 weeks. And it certainly doesn't look like Labor, who has been in government there for a long time, will have the same popularity. Even if they do go in government again, they won't have the same popularity that they have had recently. Now, if you have tuned out of what I just said, that is okay.
Welcome back.
Basically, all you need to know is that I'd say the last 2 years there has been a bit of a golden era for Labor in Australia, but it looks like that could be changing now.
Yeah, and I think that golden era, as you refer to it, came off the back of maybe a not so golden era for the previous coalition government. Of course, when Labor won the last election and Anthony Albanese began his prime ministership, that was after the COVID years, a really unpopular time for then Prime Minister Scott Morrison. So they were kind of riding that wave, I guess, of the tide turning against the coalition. Now, Labor's had their time, but as you say, Billi, things certainly feel like they are shifting again. The reason why we feel that even more now this week and that we are discussing it is because we have evidence in the form of a new poll that's come out saying the coalition is in front of Labor for the first time since 2022. What do we need to know about this one?
Yeah, so yesterday, News Corp publication, The Australian, the newspaper, they released a new poll. It's officially called the Newspoll. And it revealed that the coalition now leads Labor in the polls for the first time since that 2022 election that we've talked about.
And when we're talking about polls, Newspoll is considered, just for context, it's considered one of the most credible, most thorough polls. You'll obviously read and see lots of polls that are discussed in the media widely, but this is kind of one of those polls that is broadly taken quite seriously.
Yeah, definitely. And now this was done on a 2-party preferred basis. And this is kind of the most common polling number quoted in media, such as us. That feels very meta. We are the media. And that's even though it's not how voters are asked to vote come election day. So when you're voting at the polls, you know, it's never, do you want to vote for Labor or the coalition? You have so many different parties and independents that you can vote for. But this poll is just specifically asking, if the election is tomorrow and the choice in front of you was Labor or the coalition, which one would you vote for? And the result from that was that 51% of respondents said that they would prefer a coalition government compared to 49% who said Labor.
So still quite close.
Yeah, definitely still close. And these polls often are close, but you only need a tiny margin to become the government and to form government. Now, another question they asked is who is the preferred PM? And interestingly, despite that result that we just talked about where the coalition was ahead of Labor, the question on who is the preferred PM actually saw Anthony Albanese ahead of Peter Dutton.
Okay, so the coalition slightly edging Labor on preferred party. Preferred PM, though, Albo slightly ahead of Dutton. Do we know how much by?
Yeah, so Albanese was at 45% compared to Dutton, who was at 37%. And then there was 18% who were uncommitted. I like that frame. Non-committal. Uncommitted.
Nice. Also worth mentioning that the previous news poll had Albo at 46% preferred PM, Dutton 37%. So Dutton's approval there as Prime Minister hasn't improved, but it hasn't gotten worse. Albanese's approval has declined.
Yes.
Okay, so as we discuss these numbers, I am kind of thinking about polling in general. It can get a bit of a bad rap. I want to say probably, at least in my consciousness, since Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in the 2016 US presidential election, I've personally felt differently about polls in
You're
terms
always
of
very
my
skeptical, Emma.
trust. I am skeptical. So
that is what makes you a journalist.
thank you so much. Or just someone with trust issues. How then, Billi, should we interpret these results, this Newspoll data?
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely obviously not alone. And we should definitely interpret these with a grain of salt. I don't think, this is the Bible of truth, but they definitely can give us some insights. We know, like you said, that polls definitely have had a bad reputation. I think, between 2016 to 2020, it kind of just kept feeling like they were getting it wrong. There was the 2019 Australian election where pollsters infamously got it very wrong. I mean, everyone was so certain that Labor would win that election. And then Scott Morrison and the coalition really came through with a very convincing win.
A victory that I think even shocked Scott Morrison based on this very famous grab from his election speech.
I have always believed in miracles. I'm standing with the three biggest miracles in my life here tonight. And tonight we've been delivered another one.
And then, Emma, like you said, the 2016 very infamous example of when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump. And again, that went against what all of the polling before that election said. But that definitely hasn't meant that polling has, been thrown out of the window. I think it has just meant that pollsters have had to improve their calculation methods. And that is exactly what they said that they have done. And I think it's worth mentioning that in the past 4 years or so, I think we've had less examples of when they have been completely wrong.
And for all it's worth, for those polls that miscalculated or got it wrong, if that means ultimately we have a bolstered system, if the data is more comprehensive, if that gives us better numbers on the other side, I guess it's all worth it.
Definitely.
Okay, so we know that polls should be taken with a grain of salt. But I can't help but think, reflecting on this Newspoll data, that it has been a tumultuous period for the government. There have been a few swings and misses and a lot of criticism levelled at the government for its handling of many issues. What are some of the key contributing factors to this shifting attitude towards the government?
Yeah, I'm really interested in your perspective on this as well, Emma, because when I was going through kind of what has been a very tumultuous period for the government, it was very clear that the Labor government has really struggled to, have a quote unquote win recently. But then I was thinking that, is there such thing as a non-tumultuous period in history? I'm not sure. But to go through some of them, so Labor has had their housing bill stuck in the Senate recently. So they have had this suite of reforms that they have tried to get through, but they have not had enough support in the Senate where they do not have a majority. And that has meant that they just have legislation stuck there and the public is saying, what are you doing about the housing crisis? And they aren't able to say much. Yeah,
a lot of disunity around those housing reforms. That's what started this conversation around the potential early election, double dissolution. It's one of the first key policy issues that I can remember in a long time that the Greens and the coalition have sat on the same side in their united in their disunity against this legislation. I think that's always a bit of a flag in politics when the Greens and the coalition are coming together to say no on something.
It's a rare thing to see.
Yeah.
Also, in this term of government for Labor, they have had the voice to Parliament, which failed to get the support of the public. Yesterday, it was 1 year since that failed referendum. We actually did the podcast on it yesterday, so we will link to that episode in the show notes. We've also had the cost of living crisis, which has become one of the biggest issues that voters care about right now. There's also, of course, the war in the Middle East, which is a huge area. We know Australians care a lot about how the government is handling that. Again, there has been a lot of criticism from all sides directed to the government on how they have been handling that. Also, I think even just thinking, I was thinking about unforced errors, which I think is a term in sport that I was just thinking about. Just thinking about the census debacle recently where the government...
Yes, the census.
Yeah, where the government said that they wouldn't be asking Australians about their sexuality in the next census. And then that caused a lot of criticism. And then they backflipped and said, actually, we will. I think when that happened and the government said that they weren't doing that, a lot of people presumed that it had been a really deeply thought about result, like that they had a really good reason for why they didn't do that.
Yeah.
And then when there was all this criticism, they were like, oh, sorry, okay, we will do that. And it just felt like this unforced error. Like if you were going to change it so quickly, why did you come out and say, no, you weren't initially?
Yeah. That they brought the kind of microscope on themselves by making something a political issue that wasn't necessarily front of mind for the everyday Australian.
Exactly.
Going about their lives.
And then when the Australian public said, why did you make this decision? They didn't have an answer. There was also, this was really recently, the comment by Albanese in Parliament when he mocked Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, asking if he had Tourette's.
This nonsense that they carry on with, the idea that we're... Have you got Tourette's or something? You just sit there, babble.
Order.
I withdraw, Mr. Speaker. I withdraw.
Yeah.
I withdraw.
So I think the last two in particular, they just felt like the definition of these unforced errors, where the Labor Party had all of this negative media attention and it was something that was completely avoidable for them.
Yeah, and I think some of those moments have shed light on potential uncertainty or indecision within the party. They've been accused of that indecisiveness on those issues that seem to have created these huge political storms out of nowhere that seemed completely avoidable. We had a bit of a cabinet reshuffle. Claire O'Neill was dumped from Home Affairs. Andrew Giles was moved on from Immigration. And that caused a little bit of controversy, conversations around that those senior ministers hadn't done enough and weren't answering to their mistakes and had just been kind of moved around. Lots of headlines, lots of speculation. But again, the inner workings of what is really going on day to day, what Anthony Albanese is thinking about the next election, we can't know, we don't know, but certainly there hasn't been a lot of great PR, you could say, around the government in the last 6-ish months.
No, I'm trying to think of a win they've had. And just thinking out loud, maybe the federal budget having its back-to-back surplus in almost 20 years, that was positive PR, but I also feel like that didn't get as much media attention as possibly they would have liked.
Yeah, I think that the commentary around that was a lot of people felt that they didn't really have capacity to care about a surplus in cost of living, which really goes to the heart of the cost of living attention or criticism when people are kind of struggling to put food on the table every day. I guess regardless of the politics of the government of the day, if you're worrying about, paying your electricity bill, do you really want to hear senior government ministers telling you how great they are because there's a surplus?
Yeah. I guess another thing I was just thinking about as you were speaking, probably the HECS, they did change the student debt laws. That has probably been a win that has helped young people and especially during the cost of living crisis. But again, that's one of a whole suite of really bad PR. Now, I do think it's worth mentioning that the opposition hasn't necessarily had a whole heap of wins recently, but obviously they are not in government, and so the same level of scrutiny or the same, microscope isn't applied to them when you're in opposition, and that's one of the few benefits of being in opposition.
Also, one of the kind of patterns that we're used to seeing in the Australian political landscape is when you have a Labor government, the coalition can be pretty hard on that government when it comes to economic policy. And a lot of Australians would be very used to hearing Peter Dutton and the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor talking about the government's economic mismanagement during a cost of living crisis. That as well probably could be taken with a grain of salt given, we've seen high inflation and economic uncertainty right around the world. It is easier when you're in opposition, no matter what side of politics. It's easier in opposition to kind of criticise what's going on in front of you. But these are very, very real issues in the lives of everyday Australians.
Yeah, exactly. It will be fascinating to see what happens. And we've got, like I said, 7 months, if my maths is correct, to see how the Australian public votes and to see how they respond to these key policy areas.
I was reflecting a little bit on the political landscape of the moment, Billi, and while you were talking there, thinking about it doesn't feel like a particularly united time in Parliament anyway. It doesn't feel like, there's any one party or leader or figure or policy idea that's really winning over the hearts and minds of Australians en masse, particularly when it's such a divisive time around the world in terms of global conflict. It doesn't really feel like there's a lot of love for anyone in Canberra. And I think there is concern when you have that disenfranchisement from voters. If they begin to feel apathetic, if they begin to disengage from politics, that's probably worst case scenario, because if the community aren't engaged, no one is holding anyone to account. And, ultimately what we want is robust, healthy democracy and for everyone to really care about what's going on in Parliament.
Totally. And like you said, I think that is something that is apparent around the world. I mean, if we look at the US election again, I feel like the word divided is the word of that election that defines that election. Everyone says that America has never been more divided, and it's because of the times that we are in.
Billi, thank you so much for breaking that one down for us today. Super, super interesting. If you learned something from today's episode, please feel free to send it to a friend, leave us a review, make sure that you are following or subscribed to the podcast wherever you listen, or if you're watching us over on our YouTube channel. We will be back with another episode of The Daily Aus tomorrow, but until then, have a great day.